for their Last Supper together, Jesus and his disciples found or rented a vacant upper room. Now, normally for a dinner like this, the host would have a house servant kneel before one of the guests with a basin of water and a towel, remove their sandals, and begin washing all the dirt and filth and grime of the hot day off their feet. And then the servant would move on to the next guest's feet. And then the next guest's feet. And then the next. This most demeaning or humiliating responsibility fell to the household's lowest ranking servant or slave. But according to Jewish historians, what was normally considered a shameful duty to most, for some, was a means of expressing devotion. For example, these two stories dated to around the time of Jesus. Rabbi Ishmael returned home, and his wife kneeled to wash his feet, but he refused her, claiming it was too demeaning a task for her. She argued that it was in fact her honor. Then a newlywed couple, Joseph and Asenath. Joseph arrives home, and his new wife, Asenath, kneels to wash his feet. And Joseph protests that his bride should ever perform such a task. And as he's calling for their servant girl instead, Asenath protests, "No, my lord, because you are my lord now, and I am your maidservant. Your feet are my feet. Your hands are my hands. Another woman will never wash your feet." The commentator goes on to add, when a wife performed this task for her husband, or a child for their parents, or a disciple for their teacher, it was always an act of extreme devotion. But as Jesus and his disciples reclined at the table together in a rented room where there is no servant to perform this task, and since none of the disciples had offered to wash the feet of their teacher or their fellow disciples' feet, Jesus gets up and performs the task of foot washing for them, taking the position, the kneeling, humbling posture as the lowest servant among them, saying to them, "Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you." Jesus not telling us to follow him in obligatory foot washing, but that his disciples, Christians, follow his example of expressing extreme devotion to one another by living as the least servant of one another. Which in this morning's next Matthew passage that Jesse is coming now to read, it's how Christians can come closer to Jesus.
Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to him with her sons, kneeling down and asking something from him. And he said to her, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "Grant that these two sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand and the other on the left, in your kingdom." But Jesus answered and said, "You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? Be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They said to him, "We are able." So he said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it is prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard it, they were greatly displeased with the two brothers. But Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
Thank you, Jesse. So Jesus and his disciples are on the road to Jerusalem, and one of the many women who accompanied and cared for the group, called the mother of Zebedee's sons, the mother of the sons of thunder, James and John, she comes with them kneeling before Jesus with a request. And Jesus responds to her, well, the same way we've been learning, God responds to all of his followers. He says to her, what do you wish? The Greek word for wish there, Jesus is asking her, what is your will? What is it you desire? What do you want of me? Although I do like wishes. Now, it seems that this is the same question God asked Solomon. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask, what shall I give you? How would you answer God if he asked that of you? Now, my mind just involuntarily goes to more wishes, of course, right? And then perfect health and unlimited wealth, right? Imagine all the good I could do with it, all the people I could help, all the wrongs I could right, and why not me? Although if God had asked me that when I was 5, I would have said, lightsaber. And I know that because when I was 5, I did pray to God for a lightsaber. Right? All that I might have once wanted from God is reflected of an immature, selfish, self-ambitious, self-serving heart. Unlike Solomon, who answered God, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? Solomon's desire was to be a better leader, to better serve God's people on God's behalf. And this speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Prayers that reflect the servant heart of Jesus are some of the prayers that are pleasing to God. So God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have you asked for riches for yourself, nor have you asked the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. Praying to be a better servant on God's behalf to God's people, God elevated him. Luke 14:11 coming to mind. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, in our passage, the prayer of Zebedee's wife and sons was for James and John to be closer to Jesus, as close as anyone could possibly be, which is hopefully what every Christian wants, right? It's what Jesus wants. But they wanted it in a way that would exalt them over the others. These positions to the immediate right hand and left hand of the king usually reserved for those ranked next in honor and authority. Right? She said to him, grant that these 2 sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand, the other on the left, in your kingdom. Now, before we're too critical about her request, right, keep in mind all of Jesus' recent teachings that she's been hearing in response to Peter's question, see, we have left all and followed you, therefore what shall we have? Jesus teaching that when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And anyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or any good thing for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. And then through the parable of the vineyard workers, about God's immense grace, Jesus tells them, God will give you nothing less than all his right rewards. Right, so I think after these repeated teachings reinforcing all the unimaginable blessings God has promised her sons over and over, and since some 2 disciples have to sit in those 2 thrones closest to Jesus, is she really just asking about, seating arrangements? But she and her sons, these followers of the Lord, so focused on their heavenly blessings, seem to have missed or ignored Jesus' most recent teaching from last week's passage about what else they were inheriting from him. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and deliver him to the Gentiles, to mock, and to scourge, and to crucify, and the third day he will rise again. So many in Christian circles, like Zebedee's wife and sons, like so many preachers, make the mistake of over-focusing or over-emphasizing God's blessings that come with being God's child. They overemphasize the promises of God, our heavenly rewards, our rising with Jesus' resurrection. They overemphasize, come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And he who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely, just freely give us all things? And he withholds no good thing from those who walk with integrity. Right? Repeated teachings reinforcing all the unimaginable blessing God has promised Christians. And correctly understood in their context, they are, of course, all applicable to Christians. And so I can hear some of you thinking, how can any of these things possibly be too overemphasized? Well, sharing in Christ's blessings receives too much focus or overemphasized by Christians when sharing in his sufferings for bringing the gospel into the world is underemphasized, downplayed, or outright ignored, or we're taught and begin believing that suffering shouldn't happen to Christians at all, which is a very popular belief in Christian circles. And when Christians get their perspective warped like this, that the life of a good Christian should be all blessings and no sufferings, like I suspect Zebedee's wife and sons were, only focusing on some of Jesus' teaching, ignoring others, when this happens, you will start seeing God like a genie in a bottle who exists only to grant you wishes, and then be disappointed with him when he doesn't. Forgetting that the disciples' life, the Christian's life, isn't characterized by self-fulfillment, self-exaltation, self-seeking, but by self-denial. Right. Thank you. Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. So to Zebedee's wife and son's prayer request to be closer to Jesus in a way that exalts them over the others for self-fulfillment, self-exaltation, self-seeking, Jesus doesn't say yes or no. But he answered and said, you do not know what you ask. They are asking to be exalted closer to Jesus, and they will be. Right? Jesus promises every Christian we will all one day be exalted closer to Jesus. But Jesus also promises it's on the other side of first sharing in his sufferings for bringing God's gospel into the world. But Jesus answered and said, you do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? They said to him confidently, right, proving they don't know what they're asking, we are able. So he said to them, you will indeed drink my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those whom it is prepared by my Father. Jesus' cup of suffering was so intense, hoping to avoid it, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Right? It was through self-denial, totally forgetting his own will, totally disregarding his own desires, that Jesus was able to bring God's saving gospel to all of us. Likewise, it's through self-denial, forgetting our own will, disregarding our own desires, that we too become able to face and endure the consequences of bringing God's saving gospel to others. As Paul reminds us, if children, then heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, then we may also be glorified together. Sharing in his blessings seems to go hand in hand with sharing in his sufferings for the gospel. Jesus telling Zebedee's wife and sons and us Christians, if you want to be closer to Jesus, share his gospel. Share the consequences. Share in his sufferings. Share in his life of self-denial, and you'll become closer to Jesus. Matthew then moves on to the effects competing for self-promotion over other Christians has. And when the 10 heard it, they were greatly displeased with the two brothers. Self-promotion, self-exaltation, self-seeking in the church causes strife and division. Now, just 2 chapters ago, Jesus already addressed this issue with his disciples, who were arguing over which of them would be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus telling them, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And whoever humbles himself as a little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then in chapter 19, many who are first will be last, and the last first. And here in chapter 20, Jesus reverses the order. The last will be first, and the first will be last. And then in our passage, Jesus again having to address his disciples about their own self-seeking over one another, called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Now, Jesus is not criticizing the world here. It is what it is because Satan is ruling it, and so those of the world are expected to operate accordingly. Right? Ambitions to increase one's own power, position, authority, control, and then abusing it at the expense or cost, harm, neglect of others is characteristic of this world's systems because it's characteristic of Satan. But having come out of the world as citizens of heaven, it's not so with Christians who relinquish power, position, authority, control to lift others up at great expense, cost, risk of harm to themselves. In the world, rulers of Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Ambitions and aspirations of self-promotion in the world is the exact opposite of what ambitions and aspirations looks like among Christians. But in the world, no one wants to be stuck with a servant's social status, the foot washer's responsibility. Right? No one aspires to those lowest humiliating positions. But Jesus, using the word servant and then slave, says, but Christians, they do. It's how we come closer to Jesus. Jesus not only calling us to follow him in his life of servitude, he modeled it for us, leading the way, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now in the world, people fall into a life of servitude or become slaves because they have no other choice, but would definitely choose otherwise if they could. But a life of servitude is the life Jesus chose to live, suffer, and die to serve all of us. It's the model Jesus left for you and for me for Christian living within the Christian community. Peter's saying, if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his footsteps. Christians following Christ make the choice to live the same life of servitude, right? Serving alongside Christ by serving one another. Giving his life for many, recalling Isaiah's preaching the gospel and Jesus' life as our suffering servant. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. He was the chastisement of our peace was upon him. It was by his stripes that we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of all of us. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear our iniquities. Jesus became a suffering servant to us and to the most worthless peasant servant and to every disposable child slave. Jesus became a servant to every unclean tent city inhabitant, to every prostitute and beggar found on city streets. Jesus became a servant to every expendable soldier, to the worst war criminals imaginable, to the most depraved sinners, even to the lowest foot-washing servant and slave. Jesus subjugated himself even lower, becoming their slave in order to serve them, to save all of us, to ransom us all from our enslavement to Satan, sin, death, this world, and hell. The Apostle Paul saying, Jesus made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of a cross. To serve you, to save you, to uplift you, to exalt you. Right? Christians don't exalt themselves because Jesus has already done that and is in the process of doing that for you. As Jesus said elsewhere, when you're invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, "Friend, go up higher." Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So where Jesus teaches us to humble ourselves as servants to one another and leave the exalting to him, Zebedee's wife and sons in our passage sought their own exaltation to the seats of honor closest to Jesus at his immediate right hand and left hand positions. Positions which Jesus repeats, on my right hand and on my left. Repeated because he knows what's coming and he will want them to remember this conversation, to recall this conversation when it comes in Matthew 27. Then they crucified him and divided his garment, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Sitting down, they kept watch over him there, and they put up over his head the accusation written against him, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then 2 robbers were crucified him, with him, one on the right and another on the left. And who was present witnessing? Many women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, that were there looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Where Jesus once told Zebedee's wife and sons they didn't know what they were asking for, Jesus would again demonstrate for them, model for them, show us and them exactly what it was that they were asking for. What seats of honor, what being closest to Jesus at his immediate right hand and immediate left-hand positions looks like. That if you want to be closer to Jesus, if you want to be nearer to Jesus in this life or the next, follow Jesus in suffering this life of servitude for one another. Jesus pictured on the cross as both king and suffering servant. It is the picture of a king's extreme devotion to his kingdom's lowliest foot-washing slave. Every single one of us. For if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. Rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Suffering for the gospel and suffering for one another, like Jesus, is how you and I can come closer to Jesus. And as we close, please stand with me and make this song your personal prayer to Jesus.